The church still stands at the edge of Miller's Hollow, leaning slightly as if trying to pull itself away from the memory of what happened inside. The paint has peeled, the windows are boarded, and the heavy wooden doors, once pushed open every Sunday by laughing children, now hang crooked, as though the building itself is too exhausted to keep them shut. Locals avoid it. Travelers pass it without slowing down. But those who grew up in the town remember the whispers, the sirens, the screams, and the way the air felt that morning, still, tense, as if the whole world was waiting for something terrible to happen. 50 children stepped through those church doors on a bright spring morning, their hands sticky with syrup from hurried breakfasts, their shoes tapping along the stone path, their voices ringing out in a chorus of chatter and innocence. Parents waved, smiling, reassured by the familiar rhythm of routine, Sunday school, then service, then home. No one noticed the unfamiliar car parked by the side entrance. No one questioned the stranger with the warm smile who held the classroom door open. No one had reason to. Inside the sanctuary, hymns swelled and fell, candles flickered, and sunlight pooled across the pews. But beneath the floorboards, beneath the soft drone of prayer, something else stirred, something that had been waiting for years. It watched. It listened. It counted every child. By the time the final hymn ended, an uneasy quiet settled over the building. Parents exchanged confused glances. Where were the footsteps? The laughter? The thudding rush of kids racing down the hall to meet them? The children's wing was silent, too silent, as though every sound had been swallowed whole. And when the first mother reached for the classroom door, her knuckles white and breath trembling, she felt the chill on the handle. A coldness that didn't belong to any spring morning. Inside, the room was empty, chairs toppled, a window forced open, a smear of dirt across the floor leading nowhere. 50 children had vanished without a single scream, without a witness, without leaving behind so much as a shoe. And in that instant, as terror clawed its way through the hallways, every parent knew the same truth with a clarity so sharp it almost cut. Their children had not simply walked out. Something had taken them. The final Sunday morning began like any other, wrapped in the comforting predictability that small towns cling to. Birds were still shaking dew from their wings, sunlight was stretching across picket fences, and the narrow road leading to the church buzzed with the soft hum of minivans and worn-out sedans. Parents called out reminders, don't forget your jacket, share your crayons, be kind, while children ran ahead, backpacks bouncing, shoes scuffing the gravel walkway. The smallest ones tugged at their mothers' hands, a few older kids chased each other across the lawn, and laughter floated in the warm breeze, carrying a sense of peace that felt as habitual as breathing. No one knew they were watching these children for the last time, or that their cheerful footsteps would soon echo only in memory. The church, old but welcoming, stood with its doors wide open as if embracing the morning along with the town. Volunteers handed out smiles and greetings, the air scented faintly with coffee and polished wood. Parents felt the usual mix of relief and trust as they let their children go, believing the church walls protected them, believing routine was safety itself. The Sunday school bell chimed with its familiar jingle, and the children gathered instinctively, pulled toward the basement classroom where they always met. Some clung to friends, others clutched their picture books or the craft papers left unfinished from the week before. Parents lingered for a final moment, watching them disappear down the hallway, the sight so ordinary and innocent that it didn't deserve a second thought. There was nothing unusual in the air, no warning, no lurking dread. It was simply another Sunday morning in Miller's Hollow, wrapped in the illusion of normalcy. But beneath that quiet surface, subtle details were out of place, small things easy to miss, easy to dismiss. A car that no one recognized but assumed belonged to a visitor. A substitute teacher the parents had never met, though his warm smile made him seem harmless. A faint smell of damp stone drifting from the stairwell leading to the children's wing. These details blended seamlessly into the background, invisible to any eye not searching for danger. As the church service began, adults took their seats, flipping through hymnals, greeting friends, bowing their heads in prayer. The children were out of sight but never out of mind, held in that unspoken trust between community and institution. No one imagined that this trust was already broken. No one imagined that behind those walls, innocence was being swallowed by something far darker than the town had ever known. It was the last moment of true peace the town would ever feel, the last breath before the world shifted and refused to turn back. The presence of the strange substitute teacher felt, at first glance, like nothing more than a harmless change in routine, the kind that happens quietly in any small-town church where volunteers rotate and schedules shift without much notice. He stood at the door of the Sunday school room with an easy smile, hands folded calmly, dressed in a plain button-up shirt that made him blend effortlessly into the scene. He introduced himself simply, without offering a last name, saying he was filling in because the regular Sunday school teacher had fallen ill that morning. The explanation seemed reasonable enough, and no one thought to question it, not when everything about him appeared so ordinary. The parents barely slowed as they dropped their children off, waving as they headed toward the sanctuary, comforted by the warmth in his voice and the calmness in his demeanor. Children walked past him with the unfiltered trust that only innocence allows, their chatter lifting into the air as they found their seats inside. Yet beneath that pleasant surface, the moment carried a subtle discord, like a single wrong note in an otherwise harmonious song. The substitute's smile held for just a beat too long, his eyes watching each child with an intensity that should have raised alarms but somehow didn't. His movements were measured, deliberate, as though he were not merely guiding the children into the classroom but counting them, studying them, memorizing their faces with an unsettling quiet that adults brushed aside as shyness. Some of the older kids, more perceptive than they knew, exchanged quick glances, sensing something off. One girl whispered to her friend that she had never seen him before and wondered why he wasn't wearing the lanyard all volunteers were required to have. Her friend shrugged, reassured by the man's friendly tone, the way he crouched to speak to the younger children, the gentle hand he placed on a boy's shoulder to guide him to his seat. Everything he did mimicked the familiar gestures of trustworthiness, movements learned and rehearsed until they blended perfectly into the space. But what no one realized was that the regular teacher had not called in sick, had not sent a message to the pastor, had not stepped foot outside her home that morning. Her absence was not a coincidence but the first quiet fracture in a carefully constructed plan. As the last child entered the room, the substitute teacher positioned himself by the door, his expression briefly shifting to something sharper, colder, before settling back into its pleasant mask. With a slow, almost reverent motion, he closed the door behind them, and in that small, unremarkable click, the boundary between safety and danger dissolved completely, unnoticed by the world above. During the service, an unusual stillness settled over the children's wing, a kind of quiet that didn't belong in a place meant to echo with crayons snapping, chairs scraping, and the restless whispers of 50 young voices. Parents noticed it in small, fleeting moments. At first, a glance toward the hallway between hymns, a faint tightening in the chest as they realized they hadn't heard a single burst of laughter or the usual muffled commotion drifting through the floorboards. Normally, the sounds of Sunday school blended seamlessly with the rhythm of worship, a comforting reminder that life continued on both sides of the sanctuary walls. But that morning, the silence was absolute, heavy, and strangely deliberate, as if someone had pressed a hand over the mouth of the entire wing. A few parents leaned toward one another, whispering that the children must be deeply engaged in their lesson, maybe working on a craft or listening to a story that required concentration. The pastor himself paused once, mid-sermon, his eyes flicking toward the back hallway as though feeling the strangeness in the air but not wanting to interrupt the flow of scripture. When asked later, several adults would admit they felt something, an uneasiness they couldn't explain, a prickling at the back of the neck, but at the time, each one swallowed the feeling, pushing it aside in favor of normalcy. After all, it was a church, a place built on trust, and questioning that trust felt unnecessary, almost intrusive. A young mother, unable to shake the uneasy quiet, stepped out of the sanctuary for a moment under the pretense of checking on her toddler in the nursery. As she passed the corridor leading to the Sunday school rooms, the silence grew even thicker, settling around her like cold air. She paused, listening, waiting for any familiar noise, a burst of childish laughter, the scrape of a chair, even a teacher's voice guiding a prayer. But there was nothing. The doors were all shut, lined neatly like sealed vaults, and not a single sound leaked through. Before she could linger, the church usher gently encouraged her back inside, assuring her that everything was fine and that children often had quieter lessons when working on group activities. Reassurance, however false, carried a powerful weight in that moment. Parents returned their attention to the sermon, convinced their concern was irrational. Yet the silence persisted, growing more unnatural with each passing minute. It pressed against the walls of the sanctuary, unseen but impossible to ignore, the kind of stillness that doesn't simply happen but is created, maintained, enforced. What the parents didn't know was that behind those closed doors, the world they trusted was already unraveling, and the quiet they found so unsettling was not the calm of focused children but the echo of a terrible act already in motion. When the final hymn faded and the last prayer was spoken, parents rose from the pews with the same comforting expectation they carried every Sunday. They would collect their children, gather their things, and head home to warm lunches and quiet afternoons. But as they stepped into the hallway leading to the children's wing, that familiar expectation began to crumble. The silence, already unsettling during the service, had grown into something suffocating, something that felt wrong in a way no one could find words for. Parents exchanged nervous glances, their footsteps echoing too loudly as they approached the Sunday school room. A few called out their children's names as they neared the door, their voices bouncing back unlived. No giggles answered, no shuffling feet or excited chatter. Only the hollow ring of their own fear. One father reached the classroom first, his hand trembling slightly as he grasped the doorknob. It felt cold, unnaturally cold, as if it had been untouched for hours rather than minutes. When he pushed the door open, the room revealed a scene that sent a wave of dread tearing through the corridor behind him. The space was empty, completely empty. Chairs lay scattered, some knocked over as if moved in hurried confusion. A lone crane rolled slowly across the floor, disturbed by the draft creeping through an open window. A child's sweater was draped beneath a table, abandoned in a way that suggested its owner had not removed it willingly. Nothing about the scene spoke of an organized dismissal or a planned activity. It looked instead like an interrupted moment, a room left behind in sudden panic. Mothers rushed in, scanning every corner, calling out names that no longer had anyone to answer them. A few dropped to their knees, searching beneath tables, checking the supply closet, opening desk drawers as though 50 children could somehow be hiding in the smallest spaces. The panic spread quickly, climbing the walls of the church and seeping into every breath. A window on the far side of the room had been forced open, the frame cracked, the latch snapped clean off. Outside, the soft soil bore faint drag marks that faded only a few feet from the building before disappearing entirely, swallowed by grass and dirt. It was as if the earth itself wanted to hide the path of whatever had taken the children. The pastor stumbled into the room, his face pale, his voice shallow as he tried to offer explanations that collapsed under the weight of reality. There were no signs of a game gone wrong, no footprints leading to the playground, no evidence that the children had walked out on their own. Parents shouted for someone to call the police, for someone to search the bathrooms, the basement, the grounds. But every second that passed, every empty corner they checked, made one thing horribly clear. 50 children had vanished, without warning, without witness, without a single cry for help, and whatever had happened to them had taken place in silence deep enough to swallow every trace of their existence. The discovery of the hidden basement came only after frantic searching had exhausted every reasonable possibility. Parents, police, volunteers, and townspeople combed through every visible inch of the church, every classroom, every storage closet, every inch of the surrounding grounds, yet nothing hinted at where 50 children could have disappeared in such a short time without being seen or heard. It was an officer from a neighboring town, one unfamiliar with the church's layout, who noticed something peculiar in the architecture, a slight variance in the measurements between the building's exterior and interior walls. The difference was small, almost unnoticeable, the kind of detail locals had walked past their entire lives without question. But to the officer, it stood out sharply, like a secret the building was trying to keep. As the search team probed the children's wing more carefully, they found a section of wall behind a row of coat hooks where the wood sounded hollow. The paint around the edges had cracked in a circular pattern, almost as though it had once been a doorway sealed shut and then carefully disguised. Tools were brought in, and with every pry of the crowbar, dust filled the air, and an old, stale smell drifted out, dampness mixed with something sour and metallic. When the panel finally gave way, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness, a wave of cold air rushed upward, so sharp and sudden it made several adults step back instinctively, as if the stairs themselves were exhaling after decades of isolation. Flashlights flickered across stone walls as the group descended, the beam catching cobwebs that stretched like veins across the ceiling. The further they went, the colder it became, the temperature dropping rapidly until breath began to fog the air. At the bottom of the staircase, the space opened into a large chamber, older than the church itself. In the center of the chamber, a large wooden table stood drenched in wax drippings and stained with marks no one wanted to identify. Around it lay scraps of fabric, some of which matched clothing the children had been wearing that morning. A few flashlights trembled in their holders as parents recognized patterns, colors, tiny details that turned their growing dread into undeniable horror. It was no longer a question of whether the children had been taken somewhere. The truth was clearer now, carved into the very walls themselves. They had been brought here, into this hidden place beneath their own church, a place designed not for worship or teaching, but for something far more ancient and unspeakably dark. When investigators began digging into the pastor's background, the shock of what they uncovered rippled through the town like a second catastrophe. 4 years, he had been the face of compassion and trust, a man who baptized their babies, comforted them at funerals, and guided them through their darkest hours with soft-spoken prayers. His voice had been a constant presence at weddings and hospital bedsides, a thread woven tightly into the fabric of the community. No one could remember a time when he hadn't been part of their lives, and that familiarity had become its own kind of blindness. It allowed him to move through their world unquestioned, shielded by a role they never imagined could hide something monstrous. But beneath the layers of kindness and devotion was a far different man, one who had been living a double life so meticulously crafted that even those closest to him never saw the cracks forming. Financial records were the first sign that something was deeply wrong. Church funds had been quietly rerouted for years, siphoned through shell charities and anonymous accounts. At first, the transactions looked like clerical errors, but the deeper investigators dug, the clearer the pattern became. The money had not disappeared, it had been feeding something, sustaining something. Not long after, a set of encrypted emails surfaced, their tone cold and formal, discussing initiates, purifications, and gatherings of innocence. The language was coded, layered with metaphor and ritualistic phrasing, but the intent behind it was unmistakable. The pastor had not simply been dabbling in a fringe belief system. He had been orchestrating, financing, and nurturing a cult that operated out of sight while hiding in plain view. Former church staff admitted, with trembling voices, that the pastor often disappeared for days at a time without explanation. He claimed he was attending conferences, ministerial retreats, or family emergencies. No one questioned him. Why would they? He was the spiritual leader of their community. But surveillance footage from neighboring towns told a different story: late-night meetings in abandoned properties, exchanges of packages with hooded individuals, gatherings where fires burned in places fires should never be lit. The pieces fit together with frightening clarity: the hidden basement, the unknown symbols, the strange substitute teacher who appeared the very morning the children vanished. Worse still was the realization that the cult had roots stretching back decades, long before the pastor had taken his role. He had inherited it, nurtured it, expanded it. The church had not just been a place of worship for him, it had been a recruiting ground, a vessel to harvest trust, devotion, and ultimately innocence. The horror of the children's disappearance was only the surface of something older and far more deliberate, a truth that shattered the illusion of safety the town had clung to and revealed the monstrous double life behind the man they once called their shepherd. The janitor's confession came only after hours of questioning, but even then his words spilled out in trembling fragments, as if each sentence carried a weight he had been trying to bury for far too long. He was an older man, soft-spoken, and nearly invisible in the daily rhythm of the church, someone everyone trusted simply because he never caused trouble and never asked for anything. But behind that quiet exterior was a fear so deeply rooted that it had hollowed him out over the years. When detectives first approached him, he denied knowing anything, swearing he had been in the supply shed repairing a broken light fixture. His eyes darted to every corner of the room except theirs, his hands twisting at the hem of his shirt, and the officers could sense he wasn't lying, not entirely, but hiding something he couldn't bring himself to face. It wasn't until one officer gently mentioned the children, the youngest only 4 years old, that the facade cracked. His breath hitched, his eyes filled, and he sank into the chair as if his bones could no longer hold him upright. In a trembling whisper, he admitted he had seen the children being led toward the basement earlier that morning. He described standing at the end of the hallway, pushing his mop bucket along, when he noticed the substitute teacher shepherding the children in a single-file line, their heads bowed, their voices eerily absent. At first, he thought it was a new type of lesson or perhaps a quiet activity, but something about the way the substitute moved, swift, purposeful, without acknowledging him, sent a cold shiver crawling down his spine. He had never seen the man before and didn't recognize him as one of the regular volunteers. The janitor followed them at a distance, curiosity battling with unease, until he saw them reach the wall behind the coat hooks. What happened next froze him in place. The substitute pressed something, he couldn't describe what, against the panel, and the hidden door slid open, revealing the staircase descending into darkness. The children stepped inside without hesitation, as though entranced, their small footsteps barely audible. Just before the last child disappeared, the substitute turned his head and locked eyes with the janitor. There was no warmth in that gaze, only a warning so sharp it felt like a blade pressing against his throat. The janitor claimed he heard a whisper, a low threat he couldn't fully recall, but the message was clear: stay silent or join them. Paralyzed by fear, he backed away, returning to his mop bucket and pretending he had seen nothing. For hours afterward, he carried the secret like a stone in his chest, convincing himself someone else would notice, someone else would intervene. But no one did. And now, sitting under the harsh glow of the interrogation room lights, he finally admitted the truth he had tried so desperately to unsee. He had watched the last moment those 50 children were alive above ground, and he had done nothing to stop what came next. The deeper investigators pushed into the cult's inner workings, the clearer it became that the group had not intended the children's disappearance to end in death. Their goal, twisted, delusional, steeped in rituals older than the church itself, was something they called the cleansing of innocence, a phrase that appeared repeatedly in journals, coded letters, and scratched carvings found both in the hidden basement and in the pastor's private study. According to their doctrine, children were considered pure vessels, untouched by corruption, and therefore ideal conduits for whatever supernatural transformation the cult believed would unfold during their ceremony. This belief wasn't born from a single deranged mind but had been built slowly, over generations, through a distorted mix of folklore, misinterpreted scripture, and the manipulations of leaders who craved power masked as enlightenment. The children were never meant to vanish, they were meant to be transformed, used, or elevated in some horrific fashion the cult convinced itself was sacred. Through recovered recordings and torn pages from the pastor's journal, investigators pieced together that the ritual was supposed to be conducted in stages. First, the children would be gathered and silenced, separated from the influence of their families and the outside world. Then, through chanting, incense, and symbolic gestures, the cult believed its members could channel a presence they referred to only as the bound light. The final stage was meant to involve the merging of innocence with this presence, an act the cult imagined would grant revelations, protection, or even immortality. It was madness, but it was meticulously organized madness, structured with a frightening sense of purpose and conviction. The journals referenced previous attempts with animals, rituals conducted in the dead of night, and small gatherings of adults who underwent lesser ceremonies. But never before had they tried a mass event involving children. What investigators eventually realized was that something had gone catastrophically wrong. The ritual had not unfolded the way the cult expected. The symbols carved into the stone walls were incorrect, out of sequence, or misinterpreted entirely. The chants recovered from the recordings were fragmented and inconsistent, as if different cult members had memorized conflicting versions. The timeline, too, was rushed. The pastor's emails revealed pressure from higher members who feared growing suspicion in the town, forcing them to accelerate what should have taken months of preparation. And then there were the physical signs in the basement, scorch marks where no fire had burned, deep gouges in the stone as if carved by something inhuman, and a lingering smell that no one could identify, something metallic yet sweet, something that made seasoned officers leave the chamber with pale faces and shaking hands. Whatever had happened during that ritual, whatever force they thought they were invoking, it had not behaved as the cult intended. It was as if they had opened a door they could not control, a door that did not care about their beliefs, their intentions, or their desperation. The children had become part of something far beyond the ritual's original design, swallowed by a mistake so catastrophic that even the cult members who survived could not fully comprehend what they had unleashed. The forensic evidence found in the chamber below the church left investigators with more questions than answers, unraveling any hope of a conventional explanation. At first, the team approached their work methodically, expecting to find fingerprints, fibers, or DNA that could point toward the fate of the missing children. But the deeper they examined the scene, the more they realized that the basement held traces of something that defied every known pattern. One of the first anomalies appeared on the stone floor, where a faint residue shimmered under ultraviolet light. It looked like dust, almost like powdered glass, but its composition didn't match anything in forensic databases. When samples were taken to a laboratory, the results returned inconclusive, with some analysts claiming the material behaved like organic tissue, while others insisted it reacted like an inorganic mineral. It was as though whatever had left that residue did not belong to any category science recognized. Even more unsettling were the scorch marks trailing along the walls, forming spirals and branching fissures that radiated outward from the center of the room. Fire investigators concluded they were not caused by candles or torches, nor by electrical sparks. The burn patterns had no known ignition point, no fuel source, and no directional airflow. Instead, they seemed to emerge from the stone itself, as if the walls had been heated from within by an intense, unnatural force. When thermal imaging scans were performed days later, parts of the chamber still emitted residual warmth, despite being untouched and sealed off since the discovery. It was impossible, yet it was real. There were also deep claw-like gouges in several areas, grooves so sharp and so precise that no human tool could have made them without leaving metal fragments behind, fragments that were never found. The markings were jagged, uneven, almost desperate, leading toward the sealed doorway as though something had tried to escape or reach the surface. The strangest element, however, came from the audio recordings recovered from a shattered recorder left in the chamber. Most of the tape was filled with static, warped sounds, and bursts of unidentifiable noise. But in the final seconds, investigators heard what sounded like whispering layered beneath the static, multiple voices overlapping, rising in pitch, distorting until they dissolved into a high, vibrating hum that caused headaches to anyone who listened for too long. Experts attempted to clean the audio, but every enhancement only made the voices more distorted, more unnatural. Some claimed the voices belonged to the missing children, others insisted they were nothing more than glitches or echoes bouncing through damaged tape. Yet no one could explain why the frequencies on the recording dipped and spiked in ways that mimicked neither human voices nor malfunctioning equipment. When the full forensic report was compiled, it read less like a scientific document and more like a list of impossibilities. Nothing fit together, nothing adhered to natural laws, and nothing offered a path toward understanding what had actually happened in that basement. Investigators were forced to confront the unthinkable. Whatever occurred during the ritual had left behind evidence not entirely of this world, traces that suggested the event was not merely criminal or psychological but something that rippled beyond the boundaries of reality itself. Here is the full ** 450-word explanation of key point number 10 **, exactly as you requested, **, without subheadings and without an ending sentence **. The tragic unraveling of the church's legacy reached its most haunting stage when the community, no longer able to ignore the whispers, confronted the fragments of its own past that had been scattered and buried for decades. Families who once clung to the church as the heart of their town now found themselves standing in the ruins of a trust they had inherited but never questioned, realizing too late how deeply the institution had threaded itself into their identities. The tragedy of the 50 missing children had been absorbed into silence, distorted into rumors, softened by the passing years, but when the truth surfaced, it did not come quietly. It rose with the force of a long-forgotten storm, shaking loose memories, reopening wounds, and revealing the scale of the manipulation that had governed their community. What followed was a relentless demand for accountability, from both the descendants of those affected and the townspeople who now understood that their loyalty had been weaponized. They sifted through handwritten letters, private journals, and forgotten police reports, piecing together the final hours of the children whose absence had been hidden behind well-crafted sermons and rehearsed reassurances. The church's remaining elders attempted to defend the institution's reputation, insisting that the current congregation should not suffer for the sins of those who came before them, but this argument collapsed under the weight of the uncovered evidence. Even those who wanted to preserve the church's legacy felt an uncomfortable shift within themselves as they confronted the undeniable pattern of deceit. The walls that once stood as symbols of faith had become reminders of every unanswered question, every plea ignored, every child whose name had been spoken in vain. Some of the families sought reconciliation through truth, hoping that exposing the past would grant peace to the spirits of the children who were never given the chance to grow up, while others demanded justice, pushing for investigations, indictments, and formal acknowledgement of the crimes long disguised as divine decisions. As the town grappled with the enormity of the revelation, a new form of collective grief emerged, one that spanned generations and connected people who had never met but shared a common shadow. The church, once the anchor of the community, stood now as a monument to unspoken suffering, and the debate over whether it should be restored, repurposed, or destroyed grew increasingly bitter. Many feared that erasing the building would erase the lessons learned, while others believed that leaving it standing would forever tether the town to a nightmare they longed to escape. In the midst of these divided emotions, something unexpected began to take shape, a fragile unity rooted not in blind faith, but in the shared determination to finally bring to light what had been concealed for far too long.